Hello everyone and welcome back to the Clutch Chess International. We are continuing with the match Magnus Carlsen versus Jeffery Xiong, and this is the last game of the match and also the last game we are going to show from the match. Then we're continuing to some other matches. It's very interesting, as the title suggests. It is all in the details, but we're gonna get to that fairly soon. So without further ado, let's check it out. Magnus with the white pieces opens with e4, and Xiong goes for the Sicilian defense with c5. Knight to f3, e6, and now c3. Magnus goes for the Alapin variation. We have knight to f6, challenging the pawn here, and now e5. Magnus advances it. We have knight to d5 and bishop to c4. So, again, attacking the knight, preparing to ruin a black's pawn structure. So, knight to b6 now, attacking the bishop, and bishop to b3. And sometimes we're gonna see a move like c4, bishop to c2, followed by the d5, but here the main idea is d6. Which just challenges a white c5 pawn, prepares to go bishop e7, castle, and so on. So here Magnus goes d4, adds another defender to the e5 pawn, and now c captures on d4. We have c captures and d captures on e5. So a nice capture fest in the center. We have knight captures on e5, and now knight to c6 with a double attack on the d4 pawn, also with ideas of capturing here, and let's say if pawn captures, you can then trade queens. So a lot of ideas here. Magnus wants to keep the queens on the board, so he goes for knight captures on c6. You could also go back knight to f3, defend the d4 pawn this way, but Magnus goes for this. We have captures on c6, b captures, and now he just castles. So now he does have an isolated d pawn, but Xiong has an isolated c and a pawn, and also he still needs at least two moves to castle. So bishop to e7, Xiong prepares to castle kingside, and knight to c3. Magnus continues development. We have castles. Black now also castles to safety, and queen to f3 now, developing while attacking. So here Magnus is basically offering the d4 pawn for the c6 pawn, which is fine for black, nothing wrong with that. A more central pawn is usually more valuable than a less central pawn. However, Xiong first goes for bishop to a6. He attacks Carlsen's rook, which means that now Magnus will play rook to d1. Also, this will defend the pawn, and now knight to d5. And it's an excellent outpost for the knight, a nice central d5 square. Also, if you capture, black will be very happy to undouble his pawns and will just have an excellent game. So here after this knight to d5, we have knight to e4 by Magnus. And also, forgot to mention, here there is a game where rook to c8 was played, but knight to d5 is a new move. So already as of move 14, we have a completely new game. So knight to e4, Magnus declines the trade, and also it will be a useful square for the knight. You can pretty much do anything you want from there, even get it to c5 in the future if needed. So here you could kick it away with f5, but if f5, then you weaken the e6 square, also not something you want to do. So after knight to e4, we have queen to b6, developing the queen, connecting rooks, and just a nice square for the queen. So here, queen to g3. Magnus is now preparing bishop to h6, which will create some mating threats towards the black king, because you will not be able to defend, as the knight is ready here to gobble up the bishop and then remove the defender of the g7 pawn. So Xiong immediately goes queen to b8. He wants to trade queens, and Magnus says, okay, weak trade, but if you want to trade, we trade on g3. So bishop to g5 challenges black's bishop on e7. And here, although you could maybe trade right away, trade bishops here, which is perfectly fine, Xiong goes for f6 instead. He wants to keep the bishops on the board, and this is a very sturdy structure, so he's not really worried about that. So first, bishop back to d2, and only now queen captures on g3. We have h captures on g3, and now bishop to d3, taking the opportunity as the bishop is on d2 to put pressure on the knight on e4. We have knight back to c3 by Magnus, and now rook f to c8, getting the rook behind the isolated c pawn. At some point, you want to push c5. So we have rook 8 to c1 by Magnus. He also brings his rook into the game, and king f7, now starting to bring the king into the game to help out with the defense of the pawns. And now knight to a4, with the idea of shifting the knight over to c5. It's an excellent outpost for the knight, as black doesn't really have any b pawn or d pawn to kick the knight away. So if black wants to get rid of it, he will have to give up the bishop pair. So bishop to b5, Xiong even forces it, adds another defender to the c6 pawn, attacks the knight, and now knight to c5. And now you don't have to capture the knight, but it is a very annoying piece. For example, puts pressure on e6, maybe rook to e1 will be an idea, then you might have some problems defending this pawn. So Xiong decides to capture it, bishop captures on c5, and rook captures, leaving white with the possibility of doubling up rooks on the c file. Or if knight to b6, which is what happened in the game, now you've opened up this diagonal. So the e6 pawn is a little bit vulnerable, so Magnus goes for not rook to a1, but rather rook to e1. And this is a very important detail, one of the reasons why I've chosen this game. For example, you want to play rook to a1, a4, and start playing on the queen side. However, if you play rook to a1 right away, then bishop to a4 is good for black. If you trade here, captures, the c6 pawn is nicely defended by the rook. So instead of going rook to a1 right away, Magnus first goes rook to e1. Now he puts pressure on the e6 pawn, and Xiong needs to defend it. So first rook to e8, and only now rook back to a1. And now it's a little bit different. Because now this a4 thrust is definitely a threat. And if you go back with rook to c8, then it's like you've given white a move. The position is the same, only the rook magically appears on a1, and you can already start with a4, which will pose some problems for black. For example, if bishop a6, you can go rook a to c1, put pressure on the c6 pawn, then bishop has to defend it, and then f4, let's say, with f5 trying to exploit this pin. White would have a very nice game. So instead of going back with the rook, Xiong went rook to d8, put pressure on the d4 pawn, but now Magnus finally gets to execute his idea. He pushes a4. Now the bishop is under attack, and now there's a problem here. It's a very complicated position. It maybe appears like it's not, but it is, because what happens if rook captures on d4? Captures bishop and captures bishop. Is black allowed to do this? This is the question. For example, if rook captures on d4, a captures and the rook captures on d2, yes, you won back your pawn. However, b captures on c6 creates a beautiful pass pawn for white. And the problem for black is you don't get to capture the b2 pawn. That's the problem. If you capture the b2 pawn, you are completely lost. But it's very interesting, so feel free to pause the video here and try to figure out how white wins here while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting the double attack. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's rook to b5. And now there are too many threats. Bishop captures on e6 check, followed by rook captures here is a threat, and also rook captures here, followed by captures, and then you pick up the rook is another threat. So the way you avoid both of these threats, seemingly, is knight to d5. Now there is no bishop captures on e6, and also rook captures on b6 is gone. But now you get rook to b7 check, king to e8, and now the very nice bishop captures on d5. You pick up a piece, and you're just up a piece, because if rook captures on b7, pawn captures rook to b8, now white even has the option of playing rook captures on a7, and you're still up a piece because black simply cannot recapture. If you recapture, then just rook here wins the game. You either have to give up the rook or capture the rook, and then white gets a queen into the game. So that's the problem, and that's why this a4 idea is so super complicated. So here, Xiong found a different trick. He played bishop to c4, which seems like it's just giving up a piece. However, it kind of isn't, but also is, because here after bishop to c4, Magnus played bishop captures on c4, and now Xiong played rook captures on d4, now with a double attack here on the bishop and also on this bishop on d2. But now, again, feel free to pause the video and try to find the winning idea for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on picking either of the two options. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, either bishop to a5 or just a5. Magnus played a5, but we are going to show bishop to a5 as well, as it's super cool. For example, bishop to a5 wins because obviously now if you capture here on c4, then first you eliminate the defender of the rook on c4, and now you're just up a piece. For example, rook captures, bishop captures, and you are up a whole bishop. So what you could do after bishop to a5 is actually go knight captures on c4, which seems reasonable. You pick up the piece, but now bishop back to c3, and that's the problem. The rook has no squares along the fourth rank to keep defending the knight. You have to move the rook back, and then white just wins a piece. If you try rook to e4, then f3, and all of the squares are taken. There's no square here for the rook, so again, now you just lose a rook. So that's not possible. So after this, rook captures on d4, bishop to a5 was a possibility, but a5 does pretty much the same thing. This is what Magnus played. Now, the point is, if knight captures on c4, then bishop to c3, of course, wins the game on the spot, as the idea is the same. You have to move the rook, and again, white wins a piece. So, after this a5 move, Xiong played rook captures on c4, but now Magnus just played a captures on b6, and it was in this position that Jeffery Xiong resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. And this a captures on b6 is the move you had to find if you decided to play a5. Now, the point is, there's no way to continue this. Your rook is under attack, so what you could do is, let's say you capture the rook, rook captures on c5, but now rook captures on a7 check wins the game. As you either lose the rook, and again you're up a piece, or black captures, and after captures you are getting a queen into the game, as the a5 square is off limits since the bishop is guarding that, so the rook cannot help prevent the pawn from queening. And after this a captures on b6, there's not much more you can do. Even if you don't trade, if you move the rook, still rook captures on a7 it does the exact same thing, so it's not a possibility. So yeah, another win for Magnus, and the match ended 11.5 to 6.5 in Carlsen's favor, and Carlsen is the one who goes to the semifinals and will face some other players who have also faced who have also reached the semifinals. So yeah, a really exciting game, at least I thought so. I do hope you enjoyed it, and that little detail, first rook to e1 and then to a1, really was a game changer. So do hope you enjoyed that as well. I would like to thank Daniel Boykis, Corey Tolliver, Gunnar Lipke, Shubham Sonavani, and Mike Hennel King for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Clutch International, checking up on your wonderful suggestion, and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.